Three quick comments on that introduction. One is, yes, if you want to find that article in the London Review of Books, Google Andrew Berry Ugly Baby. That'll get you there. Two, yes, I'm in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. Organismic is an invented word. We had a German head of department when that department was created, and you know how Germans are. Let's take some syllables and concatenate them. So it auto-corrects to orgasmic in Microsoft Word, which has in the past caused problems. We actually had a formal course catalogue listing of offerings in orgasmic and evolutionary biology. Now you'd have thought at a normal university, students would be hammering the door down, right? Not Harvard students, no, that's too frivolous. I'm not going to get into medical school if I do orgasm. And the third thing I have to say, yeah, the beard is for this, the opportunity people in the Harvard community will have to meet Alfred Russel Wallace in 10 days' time. I did channel Darwin a few years ago for the Darwin-Wallace centennial. And I made the mistake of not growing my own beard for that. Went to a theatrical costumer shortly before. I got everything else. I was perfect except for the beard. I just needed the beard. All they could sell me was a Santa Claus beard in white nylon, which didn't quite fit the bill. It's a real privilege to be here, and thank you to Kathleen and Robert and everyone else who's invited me here, made me feel so welcome. I have to say, I had a vision of Edmonton in fall, of sort of struggling through blinding snow. And I've been quite disappointed in that regard. It's delightful. So thank you very much. And thank you also for coming. I think it's wonderful what you guys are doing and really celebrating Wallace. To be honest, Wallace, and I'm a case in point, Wallace has not attracted a huge amount of attention from the real hardcore professional history of science community. Wallace aficionados tend to be marginal crackpots, such as myself. I'm an evolutionary biologist, not a historian of science. And it means that the events which are marking the centennial are, well, shall we say, variegated, somewhat heterogeneous in terms of their quality. I think this is of the lot, and there are plenty of things happening around the place, this is the most consistent and a serious attempt to grapple with the legacy of Alfred Russel Wallace. So it's a real honor and privilege to be here. As you'll gather, for me, any excuse to talk about Wallace is a privilege. So thank you for coming here to listen to that, and thank you, as I say, for inventing and hosting this series. And finally, as I've already said, I'm not a historian of science. So I'm going to sit I'm already nervous that I'm in the Humanities Centre. Okay? So this isn't going to be very theoretically informed. It's going to be naive from the point of view of a lot of humanities research. Forgive me, I'm coming at Wallace from the other side. The other thing I'm not sure about is my audience. I mean, looking at you, obviously I'm sure that you're here. But the question is, has everyone been to the previous two lectures? Is everyone now sickeningly familiar with the basic outline of Wallace's, this is a rhetorical question, don't answer it, but the outline of Wallace's life and times. I'm going to assume that most of you are, but I'm going to try and give sufficient detail or sufficient reference for those of you for whom Wallace really is a bit of a black box, you know nothing about, that you won't be left groping in the dark. At least that's my plan. I'm going to be talking about his role as a naturalist scientist, as a collector. And this isn't just going to be an account of what he collected and where, never fear. What I'm really interested in is the development of particular motifs, approaches, if you like, to his work in the field. And more interestingly, on the impact that his work in the field, day to day, fairly standard for the era, natural history collecting, the impact of doing that the way Wallace did it had on his thought and his ideas subsequently. So this is the evolution in one slide of what I'm talking about. So he was born in 1823, and he became, in his youth, interested in natural history. He's living in England, he's working with his brother as a surveyor. They're traipsing across the countryside. He's looking down occasionally, he becomes interested in the flowers of the field that he sees. But it's not until 1844 that I'm going to call him even an amateur collector. That is when he meets another to-be great Victorian tropical biologist, Henry Walter Bates. They met in the Midland town of Leicester in 1844. These are two nobodies, know-nothings. Okay? Wallace is barely educated. He had to leave school at the age of 13 because his father's financial plight took another nosedive. His father was this bourgeois figure whose really only claim to fame is that he managed to lose money very efficiently. Never made any money, just lost it. Wallace is largely uneducated. So too Bates comes from a fairly humble background. Bates, however, and Wallace, they're both interested in natural history. Bates has taken his interest in natural history to another level. He's seriously interested in beetles. Wallace is still stumbling around with his flowers. Okay? And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Bates converts Wallace to beetles. And boy, that's a conversion. And the zealot of the true convert is immediately shining through. You see this in this early correspondence between Wallace and Bates. It's lists of beetles. It's the nerdiest conversation you will ever read, actually. But passionate interest as an amateur collector. Then comes this extraordinary thing. I still think this is one of the more extraordinary events in the history of science. They're nobodies. They're nothings. They're collecting beetles in rural Britain. They decide to go to Mars, effectively, actually, in terms of their travel horizons, their experience. They've been nowhere. They decide to go to the tropics to collect. Well, they actually will go to the tropics not to collect per se, but to accumulate scientific information. They're going to do that through collecting. Okay? They want to solve scientific problems. This isn't just, I'm going to make some money as a collector. They're going to go to Brazil to study what was then called the species question. This idea is this heretical, remember, this blasphemous idea of transmutation. And they're going to bankroll the operation by selling duplicates of the specimens they get. Okay? So this is a British beetle that Wallace was very proud to have collected. This is an umbrella bird. This is an Amazon bird. And this was the kind of specimen that Bates and Wallace were interested in. It's ridiculous looking, but it commanded a good price. This is the era where the great natural history museums are beginning and opening up. There's a serious public interest. I know it's difficult to think of this, indeed to conceptualize it. This is pre-David Attenborough. Okay? So people would go to these places and see organisms that they had no conception of in these museums. And of course, if you were wealthy, after dinner, you would, once you shooed the ladies out of your presence, you would retire from the smoking room and you do a show and tell, and that show and tell would be your cabinet of curiosities, which often would contain, if you were well off, it would have a bird-winged butterfly, spectacular colours, or even better, a bird of paradise with ridiculous spiral tail feathers. There's a market out there. That's what was funding, bankrolling Wallace and Bates. And this, just to emphasize, is the lowest of the low in terms of the scientific hierarchy. Science isn't institutionalized at this stage at all. But you do have gentlemen philosophical naturalists, the likes of Darwin. Darwin's independently wealthy, he's doing science, okay? Wallace and Bates are at the bottom of the hierarchy, okay? So how did they make the transformation from professional collector to what I'm calling scientist? And this is really jumping ahead a little bit, but there's definite progression here, especially when you consider, and I hope everyone knows this, the most extraordinary, the most poignant event in the history of science. 4 years of amazing collecting, amazing adventures, amazing exploration for Wallace is terminated in the middle of the Atlantic when the boat he's coming home in catches fire. He and the crew are rescued after 10 days in an open boat. So he gets back from that 4-year journey with nothing. Here's a visual aid. So he's got nothing. But so how did he affect this evolution? Well, he's got a good agent in London, so he's been placing articles about his journeys in the natural history press. So he's got a bit of a reputation, and it's a sufficient reputation that the Royal Geographic Society, and this is Roderick Murchison, the geologist who was the president at the time, was impressed and was willing. So this is an element of professionalism. They went to bat with the British government. Initially it was going to be a naval transport, but they actually ended up persuading the government, and this is serious money, £197, just to put that in perspective. The collections that Wallace had lost, the entirety of 2 years of hard work from the 4 years on the Amazon, had been insured for £200 total. So this is a lot of money. But that's the beginning of professionalism. Okay, we'll pay your fare out to Singapore. And the ultimate moment, I mean, the real transcendent moment in terms of making the leap from lowly collector to man of science, comes, as you all know, in 1858 with the joint publication, or co-publication, call it what you will, the Tornado manuscript that goes to Darwin. Darwin is flawed, but rescued by his friends Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, and the paper is, the two papers, some of Darwin's writings, which are rustled up, and Wallace's paper are published together in at the 1st of July's meeting of the Linnean Society, 1858. And look, historians of science have spilled volumes of ink on this as to whether Wallace was unfairly treated and so on, and I'm not going to comment on that. All that matters at this stage is Wallace's response. October 1858. I love this letter. It's a letter to his mother. And you can almost sense the excitement. Remember, he's now several years into his second journey. He had this enormous disappointment after the first journey. I mean, just the balls and sort of drive to get as far as he's got. Now, finally, he is up there. He's co-published with Mr. Darwin. Mr. Darwin's famous, the author of The Voyage of the Beagle. Okay? And so you can sort of sense the excitement in this letter. He showed it to Dr. Sir Charles Lyell, thought so highly of it that they immediately read it before the Linnean Society. This assures me the acquaintance and assistance of these eminent men on my return home. That's the transition from nobody to somebody. And just finally, by way of introduction, I just want to make a point that Wallace sort of kept collecting. Yes, he returned to Britain in 1862 and became a sort of very public man, letters and so on. He kept doing science, and he loved to go out. And he did come rather fairly late in life to North America. He travelled, he took a lecture tour through the US and into Canada in 1886 to 87. So he's 64 years old. He stops off in the Rockies in Colorado. This is Gray's Peak. It's over 14,000 feet high. Wallace was he met a woman who was an expert on the alpine flora. So they went up and spent the night at a cabin somewhere just below the summit. This is a 64-year-old man on his lecture tour of North America, then cheerfully trundled up to the top of 14,000 feet peak and botanized with his lady friend. So this is an impulse, this desire to collect, to collate, and to know the natural world that stuck with it. So the guts of this talk. I want to introduce you. The real guts are here: beetles, surveying, and people. But I do want to, just by way of introduction, outline sort of what Wallace did, and I'm going to try and use his own words as much as possible because, well, he was there. Just to remind you, he started off life as a surveyor. He's traipsing through the fields, mapping, essentially. So he's learning he actually teaches himself quite a lot of mathematics at this time. But he's developing what will be, and this is one of my own words, the habit of a lifetime, which is what I'm going to call geographical awareness. He's very conscious of where he is and where he is relative to that place and to that place and so on. Okay? That is the mindset of a surveyor. Partly he was surfing the expansion of the railways, so this was good business if you were in the surveying trade. There was a lot of speculation in railways. This was the time they were expanding through Britain, and obviously if I'm planning on putting a railroad in, I need to send a survey out first. So key part of Wallace's background is as a surveyor, and I've already said that he started off as a botanist. This is the most hapless start to a great scientific career there is. So he's looking at these plants, he knows nothing about them, he doesn't know anyone who's interested in them. Okay? So he saves and saves and saves. It costs 10 shillings. This would have been months of saving for him to buy a book entitled Lindley's Elements of Botany. This was going to help him understand what he was seeing. No, this was a textbook of systematic botany. It described in great detail the anatomy of plants. It wasn't a guidebook, a handbook to botany, which is what he actually wanted. Unfortunately, the bookshop owner was kind enough to let him copy the relevant information from another book into his actual book, but not the most, if you might say, auspicious of collecting starts. Things became much more serious, as I already said, when he met this guy. This is obviously in later life. This is Henry Walter Bates. They met in 1844. Bates is into beetles. Wallace will be into beetles, courtesy Bates. And it was their mutual, if you like, building up that allowed them to do this thing of extraordinary boldness, which is to head out to the unknown, head up the Amazon. And by the way, again, so naive, so young, frankly. How did they choose their destination? Well, they read a book. In 1847, an American entomologist called Edwards published a book entitled A Voyage Up the Amazon, which painted a picture so luring of the Amazon that, the Wallace and Bates were practically on the boat straight away. But it does, if you read this, you get a sense of just how naive they were to buy it. Here we are. This is from Edwards. Monkeys are this is the rainforest. Monkeys are frolicking through festooned bowers or chasing in revelry over the wooden arches. Squirrels scamper in ecstasy from limb to limb, unable to contain themselves with joyousness. Sort of exploding happy squirrels. It's a fantastic passage and a complete misrepresentation of the environment that it supposed purports to describe. But off they go, neophytes, into the rainforest. And pretty quickly, obviously, it's sink or swim. Either they're going to develop the skills they need to make a go of doing this fieldwork, or they're going to sink without a trace. Most of what I'm going to refer to you now is from the later expedition to the Malay Archipelago, just because we've got more letters and more information. And Wallace was there for twice as long, for 8 years. This is a letter to his mother in 1854, so this is very shortly after he'd arrived in Singapore on the 5th. So this is the first leg of his second expedition. Gives a great sense, a very immediate sense of what they were up to. Charles is his young British assistant, Charles Allen, he's brought with him. Breakfast at 8, out to the jungle by 9, walk up a steep hill, dripping with perspiration. Wander about to 2 or 3, getting 50 or 60 beetles, some very rare and beautiful, bathe, change clothes, sit down, kill and pin insects. Charles ditto with flies, bugs and wasps. I don't trust him yet with the beetles. Charles, we're going to return to Charles, the problems of Charles later. Dinner at 4 and so on and so on. It's actually, to a field biologist, this reads as very familiar, especially the critical bit of the coffee early in the morning. But this is so yes, that's familiar. But this is a very different process from today. When I go off into the field, and I'm not a good field biologist, I have one of these problems, I sort of look at these things and think, God. But I've got a handbook, okay, which has got they've got a rainforest plant handbook for Costa Rica or whatever. I can just about make sense of it with the key and everything else, and all those beautiful colour photographs or whatever. Well, I said none of that. I just think, and again, this is extraordinary. You go off to this massively diverse environment. You have this rather simple understanding derived from your familiarity with the British flora and fauna of certain beetle families and a few plant families, okay? And you're going to be able to extrapolate from that foundation to this massive explosion of tropical biological diversity. It's really remarkable. And it's a real mark of the naturalist to be able to do that. The non-naturalist, me, stumbles in the forest and says, oh yeah, nice, right? I don't get it because I can't make that transfer. These guys could. What did he do for guidebooks? This is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, Lucien Bonaparte. He was not a world-conquering general. He was an ornithologist. There's always a dark sheep in a family. And he published this basically checklist of, it's in good Latin, checklist of birds of the world. So before going out to the Amazon, before going out to the Malay Archipelago, Wallace bought a copy of this, then went to the British Museum and went through every drawer of birds and annotated the margins of his copy with things that weren't mentioned in this. That's what he's going to use. Okay? What's all this thing is massive. So, not surprisingly, he writes later, look, why can't we invent the field guide? It's a real plea of a genuine field biologist who's been hampered by having to drag these massive chunks around. For 8 years he was dragging these bloody things around, okay? I mean, he said it was a great book, very useful, but over something which actually gave you simple information. So, there's the problem of identification, and the problem of dragging everything around with him. Okay, this is again another letter of his mother. This is his household goods. This is a completely peripatetic existence over 8 years. Okay, thousands of miles covered from island to island, into the interior of the islands and so on. Each time he's schlepping around a full household, and worse. Okay, when I go collecting somewhere now, I go find my organisms, put them in alcohol, pin them or whatever, very similar to what Wallace was doing. But then I make a phone call and FedEx Malaysia swings by, right? Problem solved, that's gone off. Check card, credit card, problem solved. Wallace, and again, think of the Amazon, he went up to the upper reaches of the Rio Negro, basically by himself. A series of dugout canoe journeys, schlepping all this stuff around, all these collections, these enormous collections. Yes, occasionally you can pause, dispatch it downriver, but just the cumbersome nature of his enterprise is almost mind-boggling. Now, I've said that many of the actual physical collecting processes were pretty similar to what we do today. The key thing, and this is still true today, is once you've got your specimen, you want to dehydrate it as fast as you can. So if that's an insect, you want to put it out in the sun, or you can pickle it, put it in alcohol. Alcohol effectively dehydrates your specimen. Why is that? Because once it's dead and it's moist, then all sorts of enzymes are being released into the cells and they're just going to eat the thing away. Okay? Not to mention mildew and things invading. So a lot of overlap, also some considerable non-overlap. He shot, I think, 15 orangs, which would be considered a little uncool today. And in a it's a sort of weirdly paradoxical way. Both legs were broken, one hip joint. This is him shooting away at this animal up in the tree. One hip joint and the root of the spine completely shattered, and 2 bullets were found flattened in his neck and jaws. Yet he was still alive when he fell. The ugly baby referred to earlier was the orphan of one of the individuals he killed, which he raised, or tried to raise, for several months. And you can read his correspondence. He's pained when the little critter dies. Okay. So it's this bizarrely paradoxical relationship. He's blasting away with a submachine gun at appearance, and then tending Junior like it's his own kid. What they were doing, of course, was extremely dangerous. Here's the young Wallace. This is just before going off to Brazil. This is a picture from Bates's book of the interior of the rainforest. Sickness all the time, nearly died multiple times. One of the most poignant parts of that journey was his younger brother Herbert, came out to help. He was useless in the manner of younger brothers, so he was sent back. Wallace is way upriver in the Rio Negro. Word eventually reaches him that his brother Herbert is sick with yellow fever in Belém. Bates is there looking after him. Okay? He then died a few days afterwards. but Wallace doesn't hear for many months because of the transfer of information upriver. Living on tenterhooks for that whole time, what's happened to my bro? He's responsible for his younger brother, right? And as I say, he nearly died several times. And this is the contrast here, by the way, with Darwin. It's spectacular. Darwin is the gentleman companion of Captain Fitzroy on the Beagle. When the Beagle lands in South America, the local hacienda owner is going to send a coach and four and a bodyguard and God knows who else to tend Mr. Darwin. This is the equivalent of backpack, modern backpacking. He's by himself a long way upriver. And this, one of the few moments in his writings that the Victorian male British stiff upper lip trembles. I made an inward vow never to travel again in such wild, unpeopled districts without some civilized companion or attendant. But it wasn't just himself who was endangered and, shall we say, inconvenienced by his environment. Some of the tales he tells of trying to collect with all this happening around him are just stunning. This is a wonderful passage from the Malay Archipelago. He's in New Guinea, which is epicenter for collecting birds of paradise. This is kind of why he came out. This is big. He's finally made it. The flies that troubled me most were a large bluebottle blowfly. They settled in swarms on my birdskins when first put out to dry, filling their plumage with masses of eggs, which if neglected would next day produce maggots. They would get under the wings or under the body where it rested on the dry wood, sometimes actually raising it up half an inch by the mass of eggs deposited in a few hours. And every egg was so firmly glued to the fibers of the feathers as to make it a work of much time and patience to get them off without injuring the bird. As I say, it's almost inconceivable today, given our facilities and our abilities with international travel and so on, to contend with this sort of thing. The fact that Wallace succeeded as a collector at all, and remember, he's collecting extraordinary things, is remarkable. Obviously, he lost everything, or more or less everything, on the first trip. The second trip was a stunning success from a purely collecting perspective. By his own count, he collected about 125,000 specimens. That's, when I say collected, brought back successfully to England, 125,000 specimens. That's 40 a day. 40 every day for 8 years. Now, and that doesn't include the specimens that the feral dogs of the Aru Islanders ran off with. It doesn't include the specimens taken by, rotted out with mildew. It doesn't include the specimens you had to throw away because they were so heavily infested with flies. So how can we calibrate Wallace as a collector? We can't, just counting number of specimens is kind of crude. What we want to do is, what we're mainly interested in is new things. Okay, so how many species new to science did he get? And again, this is complicated. Okay, if you're interested in weevils, beetles with long snouts, they are hyperdiverse and all over the place. Okay, you could go out. Any one of you could go and find a new species of weevil if you just went to the tropics this afternoon. Please stay for the rest of the lecture. No, the bottom line is there's lots of diversity there, and it's not well described. It's not well understood. Okay. So that's not much of an index of his collecting. Yeah, sure, he's got lots of new species of weevils, but I could do that. Now let's take a group that is really well characterized. We know lots and lots about birds, right? Everyone knows lots about birds, okay? And everyone, travelers know birds and things. So, but if you want a group of organisms that is well described, even at the time that Wallace was writing, we'll take birds. So let's look at the birds that Wallace collected during his 8 years in the Malay Archipelago. In the decade, it gives a summary account in 1865, so this is 3 years after he gets back, in which he records having discovered 212 new species of birds. 212 new species of birds. Now, there are about 10,000 species of birds total. In other words, in those 8 years, Alfred Russel Wallace discovered 2% of all bird species. I think that's stunning. And I think it's a phenomenal index of Wallace's collecting acumen. Both his ability to get hold of specimens, which is partly about being a good shot, but also his willingness to go to really the far-flung ends of the earth, places collectors had never been to before. He was really exploring Terra Nova. This is a charming entomological plot made, notice, of insect parts, save for the little pink human head. So that's just, and again, that's somewhat introductory. That's Wallace the collector. Beetles. Now, I've just been rude about beetles. I said we shouldn't use them as our index of Wallace's collecting acumen. I do, however, think that beetles were absolutely key in this story. Remember that he was introduced to beetles by Bates in 1844 in Leicester, and he was immediately struck. If I'd been asked before how many different kinds of beetles would be found in any small district near a town, I would probably have guessed 50 or outside 100, and thought that a very liberal allowance. But now I learned that many hundreds could easily be collected, and there were probably 1,000 different kinds within 10 miles of the town. Beetles are hyper-diverse. And if you're interested, as Wallace and Bates were, in exploring the roots of biological diversity, you want to work with something which has got some serious diversity. So it's sort of ironic that Wallace, for the 50th anniversary of the joint paper, this is 1908, Darwin's been dead 26 years, sorry. Wallace is still going strong, he's still got another 5 years to go, actually. He rather reluctantly comes up to London and gives a talk, which is essentially why us? Why Darwin and me? There are lots of other smart people who could have got this idea. This is not rocket science. And he gave this rather nice observation. First and most important, as I believe, in early life, both Darwin and myself became ardent beetle hunters. Now, maybe I'm sort of bizarrely literal. Historians of science have typically sort of dismissed this as a sort of naive and a typically overly modest statement. I think he's right. And that's what I want to talk about to start with. And I'm going to start with the fact that beetles, and this is key, that hyperdiversity. This is a nice, probably apocryphal anecdote, but who cares? This is J.B.S. Haldane, 20th century British biologist, asked by a Church of England vicar what Professor Haldane has a lifetime of studying the works of God in nature taught you about the Almighty. Well, says Haldane, he has an inordinate fondness for beetles. And that's a reference to hyperdiversity. We've described hitherto about 1.7 million species of things, everything from bacteria species through to human beings. Of those 350,000 so far, that's a massive underestimate. As I say, you go climb a tree in Costa Rica this afternoon, you're going to find previously undescribed beetle species. Okay? That's a massive underestimate. You compare that, we've already mentioned there's only 10,000 species of birds. Mammals? Oh, but like lions and tigers and elephants. No. 5,400. Okay? Now, and let's compare this. We're in Britain, which, I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's a northerly island. It's got a lousy climate. It's depauperate faunistically. It's not a great place to be a field biologist. It really isn't. There's not much there. All the interesting stuff got killed off a long time ago. So, for example, if you're interested in butterflies, there's 65 species, and that's a dodgy figure because it depends whether you're counting the occasional poor French butterfly that gets blown across in a gale. Okay? But this is important for two reasons. One, diversity allows you to study diversity. Two, and this is the key thing, if Wallace and Bates, remember they're nobodies, were studying butterflies, the butterfly world is full. Every niche is occupied by serious, heavy-hitting lepidopterists. right? There's no space in the butterfly universe because it's too small, in Britain at least. In beetles, you've got significant beetle diversity in Britain. So suddenly, there's an opportunity to contribute. This hasn't been, if you like, used up. So this must have been something really impressed Wallace. Bates, at the age of 18, a year before he met Wallace, had published a paper. Now, it's actually a rather charming paper. It's in the Zoologist, and it's about coleoptera beetles in damp places. And if only the modern scientific literature was as charming as this. Many a long day in sunshine and in shower has seen me wading in those miry paradises in praiseworthy endeavour to effect my little towards the advancement of our favourite science. But that's a contribution to the professional literature, and that's courtesy Beetles. And the same was true with Wallace. This, several years later, this is 1847, this is Wallace's first scientific publication in its entirety. Okay? It's not a great contribution. This is the beetle he discovered. It's published in the Zoologist, and again, this is, I mean, again, talk about a hapless beginning. We've already had the unfortunate start with the textbook of botany. Now the editor of the journal says the other insects in my correspondence list are scarcely worth publishing. That's Wallace and Bates. As you know, I'm sure, the other beetle person was Charles Darwin. This is this fantastic. The Victorians could do illustrations in the way that we fumbling 21st century people can't. Well, can't they now? Photoshop, can I? This is Charles Darwin, the border beetle, as caricatured by a friend at Cambridge. I just think it's brilliant. There he is, out beetling. As you know, this was a huge part of his undergraduate experience. It wasn't a formal part of his undergraduate experience, but it's what gave him an entree into the Society of Scientific Men at Cambridge, Henslow in particular, and Sedgwick the geologist. And I always have to explain, when I talk about this to students say, what was wrong with these guys? Just imagine if my roommate came into our room with I've got a nice beetle specimen here, put in a petition to change roommate. This was actually a very mainstream, a very fashionable activity. Remember, this is the era when these great natural history collections were expanding. And it's a famous quotation. It's a lovely statement of the significance to Darwin of beetle collecting. No poet ever felt more delight at seeing his first poem published than I did at seeing in Stevens Illustrated standard textbook, if you like, standard authority on British insects, the magic words captured by C. Darwin, Esquire. So again, this is a contribution, okay? But, and this is the most important point I want to make about the beetle side of things. The Iberiverse, they all look like beetles, okay? But the naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, Henry Walter Bates, or Charles Robert Darwin could do something that I can't do, which is, if we were to lay out on this table 100 beetle species, they look at them, bang. Then if we had 10 species, whether they're any of those 100 or not, running across the stairs here, they'd pick them up, investigate them, and know whether or not they were included amongst the 100 they've just seen. That's from a purely neurological or computational point of view, that's an extraordinary thing they've just done. They've taken something and they've run through a 3D database looking for similarities, points of difference, and so on. This is a really subtle exercise, and it's what a great naturalist can do, even with material they've never seen. And I love this anecdote that Darwin tells. Later in life, so off he goes on a beetle. Beetles sort of fade into history for Darwin. But 20 years later, he's at Down House, he's walking down the park, and the black form squiggles across in front of him. He knows instantly, so that database is absolutely intact. He can test that new species against the database. He knows it's rare, unusual, one, and two, that it's similar to something else that he has seen, but sufficiently different. That's amazing. Okay? That's the skill of a naturalist, a great naturalist. Okay? And that's what these guys derive from working with beetles. And by the way, this is purely sidebar. I love this. I'm an evolutionary biologist. We are fated always to cite Darwin. Darwin, 1859. Ever since the origin of species. This is such a great book, and there's so many wonderful ideas in it. Gets a bit boring. It's much more exciting to cite Darwin, and Darwin. 1859, same year. Okay, and it's really cute. Actually, it's the Darwins aren't Charles. They're the junior Darwins. This is reeks of paternal pride. His boys had found an interesting set of beetles, and he was going to publish them. And there it is, Darwin, and Darwin. Now, and this is another rather long quotation, but this is just to make the point that this phenomenon is a real and general phenomenon. What I'm going to call the naturalists on board database. This is Ernst Mayr, the very same German who invented the word organismic. A famous evolutionary biologist of the 20th century, one of the great figures of 20th century science, actually. And he's a German biologist, but he had spent some time in New Guinea studying birds. And this is written by Jared Diamond and John Terborg, who were graduate students at Harvard, and they'd gone off to New Guinea and collected a bunch of birds. Now, he'd been there 36 years previously. He walked along the shelf and glanced at one specimen after another. He quickly identified each by its Latin species name and then by its subspecies name, told us which zoologist described it in what year and what journal, gave the alternative names under which zoologists discussed it, and so on and so on. It's extraordinary. Okay? Even though, again, in principle, this was a rusty muscle, so to speak. This was way, way old work so far as he was concerned. Final thing I want to point out on beetles, and it's beautifully highlighted in this passage from Huxley's review in the Times. So this is Britain's leading newspaper. This is Huxley's review of the origin of species. This is a high-profile review. Let the botanist and all the zoologist examine and describe the productions of a country, and one will pretty certainly disagree with the other as to the number, limits, and definitions of the species into which he groups the very same things. This is a key part of Darwin's rhetorical argument, that you've got variation, you've got different kinds of this, a different color, a different form, and so on. It's variation, and eventually you blur into a new species. So in other words, the notion that species are something special is bogus. They're not special and created, they're just part of a continuum for Darwin of variation. Even in the calm region of entomology, where if anywhere in the sinful world passion and prejudice should fail to stir the mind, one learned coleopterist will fill 10 attractive volumes with descriptions of species of beetles, 9/10 of which are immediately declared by his brother beetle-mongers to be no species at all. This is a key issue at the heart of the species question, and Huxley is using beetles as the vehicle to explore it. So, the importance and power of an onboard beetle database, which means, therefore, an instinctive understanding of difference both within and between species. And in investigating these things, an appreciation for design. That this beetle has an elytron shaped this way because it lives here, and one that lives in this slightly different environment has a differently shaped elytron. Okay? Design. If you're a natural theologian, of course, that's God crafting each species. Or, if you're Wallace and Darwin, it's crafted, designed by natural selection. That's beetles. And that was the longy, by the way, just so you know. Surveying in history, just to remind you, Wallace was a surveyor by training, and he absolutely continued his mapping activities, certainly through the Amazon expedition. And one of the few things that he did rescue, as the ship went up, he seized one small case of notes and drawings. Those did include his mapping notes, his cartographic notes, for the Rio Negro, and specifically the upper reaches of the Rio Negro. So this was basically unexplored territory. So, and this, by the way, was one of the reasons you could get the Royal Geographic Society on side in terms of arranging his transport to Singapore, because they were impressed by the fact that he produced this extremely workmanlike, and it turns out extremely accurate map. This remained the sort of reference map for the region for decades afterwards. So the fact, again, remember he's doing all this alone. He doesn't have a surveying system. He's having to do all the sightings and all the compass bearing, all the work by himself, remember, in his dugout, suffering from dysentery, with yellow fever, with a pile of fetid animals waiting to be pickled. Okay? But it's this thinking that created what I'm calling geographical awareness. Now, what do I mean by that? Why is it relevant to the story of Alfred Russel Wallace? Wallace was very sensitive to geographical difference in the plants and animals he saw. One reason was this reason. Because he's very geography focused, okay, because of that surveying background, he's interested in where he is relative to that place and so on. The second reason is also interesting. Remember, he's collecting for a living. This is a financial reality for him, okay? So I stop here as I travel upriver, and I find a specimen that looks like this. I travel 50 kilometers upriver, and I've got another specimen which is certainly very similar. Is it sufficiently similar that I call it the same species? What constitutes sufficiently different to be two different species? He's thinking about all these things the whole time. Why? Well, partly because he's interested, but also because if they are two different species, he can sell them for more money. Okay? So there's a commercial imperative underlining the joint scrutiny of geography and biological difference. This is beautifully stated. He's in the Aru Islands, or the paper is written on the basis of the Aru Islands, but he's looking at two areas of basically similar climate. You go to New Guinea, wet rainforest. You go to Borneo, wet rainforest. Okay? Very similar. Now, the argument by design is God looks down and says, oh, this kind of environment, here's the perfectly designed organisms I'm going to put in there. And here's New Guinea and Borneo. Why can't they spot the difference in terms of climate and so on? No, it's the same. I'm going to put the same things down there. That's the argument by design. What Wallace sees is actually extremely different, the flora and fauna of New Guinea and Borneo. It's crazy. Why should that be? And what's more, if you now look at Australia and New Guinea, which are extremely different. One is a wet, tropical, forest-clad island. The other is largely a desert. Okay? Now you've got actually a lot of similarity between the flora and fauna. So how can you... So this is a geography meets biology conundrum. How can you account for it? Well, famously, he argued there must be a lot of interesting history going on. Two sorts of history. One is a biological history, so which today we call an evolutionary process, which is resulting in, so you have a certain group arises at location A and then diversifies at location A. A different group arises at location B and diversifies there. That's why you've got two very different sets of taxa at these two places. But there's also the geological history. So maybe, now Wallace was stuck, he didn't have plate tectonics, he didn't have continental drift, so he was positing continents that rose from beneath the oceans and then sank again, whatever. But he had to posit certain connections, so he suggested that New Guinea and Australia, connected by a shallow sea, were maybe at certain times, and this is, we now know, perfectly true, connected by land bridges. Okay? Same with Borneo and Sumatra, connected by land bridges. Okay? So, from his sensitivity to geographic biological variation coupled with his sensitivity to geography, he's constructing a beautiful historical vision of how and where animals and plants have come from and why you've got the distribution we have today. So this was most famously enunciated in what became known as the Wallace line, He didn't call it that. It was dubbed that by Thomas Henry Huxley. He was traveling, this is the real naturalist in Wallace. He missed a boat from Singapore to Makassar in Sulawesi. So he had to do it indirectly, which was from Singapore to Bali to Lombok to Sulawesi. So it was a source of frustration. He was trying to get to Sulawesi, but he wasn't getting to Sulawesi. So he spent a bit of time, actually very little time in Bali, and then a few weeks in Lombok, and say, between boats. And noticed that even though these two islands are about 30 kilometers apart at the narrowest part of the channel, they have very different flora and fauna. And the bottom line, and by the way, there are now these sort of more other lines for different sets of taxa which you can blindly ignore. The bottom line is this: here is shallow ocean. This is essentially one tectonic plate, the Sunda region, and this is another one, the Sahul region, with Australia, New Guinea, and so on. This and that have very different histories. And the cool thing now we know is that these two were a long way apart, okay? And they have been converging through continental drift over, I might say, recent years, last week, recent geological time. So the proximity of Bali and Lombok is a recent geological phenomenon, and therefore, in a sense, that difference between them will erode as migration occurs between the two sets of Asian animals, monkeys, and Australasian animals, kangaroos. Final thing on the geography point I want to make is a stunning and massively overlooked, this is Wallace, so of course it's overlooked, paper in 1864, in which he enunciates the biological species concept. This is something people get taught in high school. What is a species? A species is a group of organisms that can breed amongst themselves, but not with other ones, and then attempt to eat us and a chimpanzee to reproduce is destined to failure. We're one species, they're another species. Okay. Typically, we're taught that was discovered in the 1940s. Wallace, species are merely those strongly marked races or local forms which, when in contact, do not intermix, and when inhabiting distinct areas, are generally believed to have had separate origins and to be incapable of producing fertile offspring. Beautifully put. And again, a product of this joint awareness of geography. He's traveling from one location to the other. He's looking at, and the variation, the biological variation that he's seeing enacted there. Final thing, it's a bit like Darwin. And so Darwin was a beetle guy to the end. Even when he was doing beetles, it was still there, that database. Wallace was the same with his surveying skills, with rather unfortunate consequences. This is poor old Wallace. A whack job called John Hamden in 1870, he's a flat earther, offers 500 quid. Now this, Wallace had a capacity for losing money equaled only by his own father. What, 500 pounds? Just to do some surveying, so which he duly did, just to show that actually on a body of water there was some curvature. A very elegant, simple surveying solution. Give me the 500 quid. Unfortunately, when you take 500 quid from a certified loony, there's hell to pay down the road. So there were just court case after court case as Mr. Hamden claimed that Wallace had cheated in proving that the Earth was round. But yes, Wallace kept surveying, even if it didn't do him any favours. Final thing I want to talk about is people. So, Wallace is having a very different experience from Charles Darwin as he travels. Darwin, remember, is this elite guest. Yes, he encounters native peoples, but usually at a distance. Wallace is dependent upon local people. Okay. Now, yes, it's true he's got his assistant, Charles Allen, I've already mentioned him, who's come out with him on his second expedition. Turns out to be a bit of a bust. Here's a letter to his mother just after arriving in Singapore. Charles will soon be very useful if I can cure him of his incorrigible carelessness. Can't trust him to do the smallest thing without watching that he does it properly. I might as well generally do it myself. We've all worked with undergraduates. This is now a year on. He writes to his sister. It's a long quotation, but it's actually a fantastic quotation. Charles, look at these butterflies. You set out, yes, sir, yes, sir. Look at that one. It's set out evenly? No, sir. Put it right there. 5 minutes, he brings me the box to look at. Have you put them right? Yes, sir. There's one with the wings uneven. Okay. So, bottom line is that Europeans aren't always your best field assistants. Okay? And as many of you will know, Wallace formed a very close bond with this man in particular, Ali, who saved Wallace's life on a number of occasions, and was initially hired to teach him Malay and be a sort of dog's body and cook, but soon became his right-hand man, his main collector, his boatman, and so on. A real superstar in the Wallace story. And the nicest part of the Ali story, in my opinion, is a visit to Ternate, I think 1908, by an American herpetologist called Thomas Barber, who was doing his collecting, walking through along a beach, I think, when a wizened old man wearing a blue hat approached him and introduced himself in English as Ali Wallace, which is rather nice. So Wallace is working with people, and as you know, he was living in local circumstances. I love this picture from the Malay Archipelago. This is his hut. He is some local. That's Wallace. Okay, the hut was too small to actually live in, so he set up his desk and his chair under the hut, and he would go up the little ladder and sleep. Okay, so he's living local. Also, he's sort of become somewhat attuned to local ways. This is a sad passage from the Malay Archipelago. So he's finally made it to New Guinea, and he's brought with him some of his Indonesian hunters, including a boy called Jumat. He was about 18 years old. He's died. A native, quite loud, not very active, but doing his work pretty steadily. As my men were all Mahometans, I let them bury him in their own fashion, giving them some new cotton cloth for a shroud. So we do get the sense that Wallace, in strict contrast, frankly, with most of the Victorian explorers, Darwin was a fine abolitionist. Thomas Huxley was a good liberal, but they were racists. Okay? Huxley writes that the dusky races will never attain the higher echelons of society. Okay? So we like to think of Wallace as a non-racist, and this is a lovely quotation, and I use it a lot. The more I see, he wrote it in a letter in 1855, the more I see of uncivilized people, the better I think of human nature on the whole, and the essential differences between so-called civilized and savage man seem to disappear. But I have to say, and it's just a caveat, I'm guilty of using that quotation out of context. He was still a product of his own times, and so to describe him as this sort of 21st century non-racist enlightened individual is, I think, pushing the boat a little too far. If we look at the rest of this quotation, here are we, two Europeans surrounded by a population of Chinese, Malay, and Dayaks. The Chinese are generally considered, with some truth, to be thieves, liars, and careless of human life. And these Chinese coolies are of the lowest and least educated class. The Malays are invariably characterized as treacherous and bloodthirsty, and the Dayaks have only recently ceased to think headhunting as an absolute necessity. So, Wallace wasn't, shall we say, the purest, most enlightened of people. He still had that imperial white man noblesse oblige, plus the sense that everything will fall before the civilizing technological achievements of Western society. So this is a statement about New Guineans. If the tide of colonization should be turned to New Guinea, there can be little doubt that the early extinction of the Papuan race, a warlike and energetic people who will not submit to national slavery or to domestic servitude, those are apparently the only options, folks, must disappear before the white man as surely do the wolf and the tiger. So, okay, message there is Wallace isn't perhaps as benignly non-racist as we like, but he certainly was hugely progressive by the standards of his time, absolutely. And it gave him a scientific problem. It's a really interesting scientific problem. problem. Which is, so there he is, he's in the Aru Islands. He's living in a hut with a guy who wears a piece of grass around his waist as his only clothing. Okay? Wallace knows that this guy has the mental capacity to do everything that a smart gentleman in a London club can do. He can declaim Horace's odes. He could play Chopin etudes on a piano. This guy could do all those things. But he's never going to, because he can't read, he's never seen a book, and he's certainly never seen a piano. Okay? So we've got a problem. His brain is over-engineered. His brain has all this capacity to do things which it'll never have the opportunity to do. Okay? Now Wallace betrays a very good understanding of natural selection. Natural selection does not endow anything or anyone with abilities which might be useful down the road. Okay? Here's a herd of zebra. There are no lions in this room. There's no natural selection operating to make those zebras run faster. Okay? But you might say, well, look, it's a really good idea if you learn to run faster because lions might come in through the door. Yes, it would be a good idea. That's not how natural selection works. There's no advantage to being faster in that herd of zebras. Okay? Natural selection solves immediate problems. So how could natural selection over-endow these savages with these mental attributes? So, Wallace decides to take humans out of the pure natural selection picture. He decides there must be something else. Now, around the same time, he's also becoming a spiritualist. Now, that's an amaterial explanation of aspects of humanity as well, because these, by definition, are things that come back after corporeality and physical us have gone. Okay? So, in other words, there has to be some supernatural force to hypodermic in those spirits or whatever, however it happened. Okay? Bottom line, Wallace decides there's some teleological force, call it what you will, which is interfering in evolution for one species and one species only, ours. Problem, this is the crown jewels of the theory of evolution. The evolution of our own species. Remember, Darwin had carefully not mentioned humans. Don't mention the H word, Charles, in the origin of species because he thought it would be too inflammatory. Okay. So poor old Darwin. Darwin's horrified. His offside, and Wallace has been great. Wallace has been like a mini Huxley. Huxley is his bulldog. Wallace is his terrier. Okay? Wallace has been trotting out and slaying dragons. People have been criticizing Darwin. Wallace has gone off and done a beautiful demolition job. I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my own child. I differ grievously from you and I'm very sorry for it. And I love this exchange though. This is such a great relationship. So, Descent of Man, this was written in 1869, which is when Wallace went out in public about his views on man, on humans. Here, and then the Descent of Man is coming out 2 years later, and then Darwin writes, fate has ordained that almost every point on which we differ should be crowded into this volume. And Wallace, I love this. I look forward with fear and trembling to being crushed under a mountain of facts. It's such a great response. So that's huge. And that's an impact of his collecting. It's this backpacking, this dependence, this living off the land, if you like, that has given this respect for the people he's working with, and hence this realization or his supposition that the human brain is over-engineered in that case. The second thing, it's my final point, is it was the makings of him as a socialist. Now, Wallace famously was influenced by utopian socialist or proto-socialist thought as a young man, but it was in the Malay Archipelago that these ideas really crystallized. But they're present even earlier. This is from the Amazon book, when he decides to write some verse. Must millions suffer these dread miseries while but a few enjoy the grateful fruits? This is capitalism. For are there not, confined in our dense towns and scattered over our most fertile fields, millions of men who live a lower life, lower in physical and moral health than the red Indian of these trackless wilds. So the notion is, yes, we're advanced, we're civilized, we're sophisticated, we've got industry, we've conquered nature, we had the Industrial Revolution. But look at us. These great heaving ghettos in the cities, the productive cities in the middle of England. Poverty, extreme poverty, coupled in good capitalistic fashion with great wealth, the factory owners' wealth. And he closes the Malay Archipelago with this wonderful, ringing condemnation. This is the Wallace I love. Okay? The Malay Archipelago is a book about science, it's a book of adventure, it's a book of exploration. But Wallace is ultimately this fantastically public, he's evangelical, he's engaged, he wants to get his message out. And here it is sort of in the wrong place, frankly, but no, it doesn't matter. Now, it's very remarkable that among people in a very low stage of civilization, this is a Dayak longhouse, we find some approach to such a perfect social state. I've lived with communities of savages in South America and in the East, with no doors or door codes, but the public opinion of the village freely expressed. Each man scrupulously respects the rights of his fellow, and any infraction of those rights rarely or never takes place. In such a community, all are nearly equal. A truly egalitarian community, the Dayak longhouse. We should now clearly recognize the fact that the wealth and knowledge and culture of the few do not constitute civilization and do not in themselves advance us towards a perfect social state. Our vast manufacturing system, our gigantic commerce, our crowded towns and cities support and continually renew a mass of human misery and crime absolutely greater than has ever existed before. So this, as you know, I'm sure, is a trope which would come to dominate Wallace's life. This is actually a really interesting mini story. This section of the book was read and admired by the philosopher economist J.S. Mill. Mill asked Wallace to become involved with some efforts that he was making towards land tenancy reform, which ultimately, and this is down the road, in 1881, Wallace became the founding president of the Land Nationalization Society, which was dedicated to the notion that private ownership of land was, if you like, the root of all social evil. Landlords ripping off their tenants and so on and so forth. If we had a proper state-enforced system where everything was fair and evenly divided, we would be much better off. And so this is born ultimately from Wallace's life in the field, by himself, largely isolated, completely dependent upon local people, and having the openness and respect to understand that these guys might be primitive, they might only be wearing pieces of bushgrass around their waist, but they've got some things seriously right. And as you know, the rest of his life, he was a dogged and noble socialist. To allow one child to be born a millionaire and another a pauper is a crime against humanity, and for those who believe in a deity, a crime against God. So I hope I've convinced you of the fact that Wallace's collecting practices obviously made him a superb collector, just probably the greatest biological explorer ever, in my opinion. I still think that figure, 2% of all birds in 8 years, is stunning. But he was so much more than just a collector. And it was these, if you like, knock-on effects of his practice in the field, his engagement in particular with local people, the respect that engendered, that had a huge impact upon the life and work